Hi, and good evening, and welcome from the moors of ConTinual Castle. Tonight, we're going to be diving into the joy which is European historical fiction. But before we get started, I'm going to be your host, Jim Nettles. Let's find out who else has decided to come in and join us. So, Wendy.
Hello, everybody. I'm Wendy Van Camp. I'm an author, a speculative poet, and an illustrator of my poetry. My first book is called The Curate's Brother. It's a Regency historical based off of Jane Austen's book, Persuasion. It can be considered a prequel to her book, but also it is a standalone of its own. And I use a lot of my expertise in trying to bring the Regency era into my book, and I'm hoping to discuss more of some of the techniques I used to do that in my prose.
So, Susan, I'm going to let you go first.
Ooh, that's a nice. Thank you, Jim. I'm Susan Griffith. I am one half of the writing team of Clay and Susan Griffith. We're authors, comic book writers. Our books are Vampire Empire and the Crowning Key series, as well as some media tie-ins. And is there anything else
Nope, we do historical fantasy, much of it in the European setting, although we do stray outside as well. And that's about who we are.
Katherine?
Hi, I'm Katherine Cowley. My series, my debut novel came out last year, The Secret Life of Miss Mary Bennet. It's a historical mystery set also in the Regency, and books 2 and 3 are coming out soon. And I just love getting into the nitty-gritty of history and reading old newspapers and just kind of immersing myself and finding all the little interesting details.
Dawn?
Yeah, I am Dawn Dehel. I write under the name D.S. Dehel, and I have 2 historical fiction. One is a retelling of Gawain and the Green Knight, but moved up just a little bit in time into the early 15th century, and a short story called Kissing Strangers that is set during the Edwardian era. It's a ghost story.
Matthew?
Matthew Saunders. I have the Daughters of Shadow and Blood trilogy, which is a trilogy about the brides of Dracula. So it covers about 400 or so years of Eastern European history. I also have a series of short stories called the Serbian Bureau of Strange Occurrences, which are steampunkish stories set in and around Serbia around 1850, about 2 monster hunters who work for the Serbian government to cover up supernatural incidents. Yeah, a lot of history in the stuff that I do.
Nancy?
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books. The books on the screen with me are the Boar King's Honor Trilogy, which has a Richard III theme. And the first book is set during the Restoration, which is the reign of Charles II. The second book is set during the Regency. And the third, which will be out this year, is set during the Second World War.
So I want to dive a little bit in. Let's talk about what kind of historical periods really pull you in. What are your personal preferences? Because obviously, as writers, we like to write about those things that we enjoy or that we want to research or the fun rabbit holes we get to fall down. So I want to kind of dive into what pulled you into the period you write about, and really what are the favorite aspects of that period that really draw you in. So Clay and Susan, I'll let you guys go first. And y'all don't have to answer together. You don't have to agree with them. I promise.
Sure. I think primarily we started out with Victorian, because we both grew up with Victorian literature. We grew up with Victorian mysteries, Sherlock Holmes, etc. Dracula was a book that had a huge impact on me as a child. So the clothes and the carriages and the everything, the gas lamps and the fog, the whole deal is compelling. We've moved outside of that a little bit. I studied the Italian Renaissance. We've never written Renaissance, although I've plotted numerous books none of them. I actually plotted a comic book series one time that was a Renaissance fantasy, but it fell through. Surprise! Shockingly, it fell through. But those were, and I went to school. I used to teach African history, so that was another period that I've used a little bit from the colonial aspect, but not as much as I'd like.
And I was not a big historian person. I would read a lot of historical books, but I had really a lot of connection with history until I met Clay, and we traveled a lot, and he managed to tell stories so vividly through his historical background. When we went to Italy, especially, and in Scotland, I was just mesmerized and suddenly became just immersive into a lot of the various cultures and periods that he had been talking about. I love Scottish history. There was a lot that we did. We wound up setting a whole series of our books there because we both fell in love with Scotland and actually got married there. And those images, those moments that we've been able to, portray in the books have meant a great deal, and studying through all that history has been phenomenal.
How about you, Katherine?
Well, I always liked history from the sense of how everything in culture connects. I actually studied humanities in college, and because I was going to study English because I'm like, well, I love reading books. And I got into the first few English classes and I'm like, this isn't quite how I want to study literature. So I ended up studying humanities, because then you're looking at how does the literature connect to the architecture and the art and what's happening politically and socially, and how does this relate to the landscapes, and how does this relate to how do all of these things connect? And that's kind of what I've always liked to do with history and with literature, is kind of look at this and like, how do all these things connect? In terms of my series, I read Jane Austen very young, Pride and Prejudice. And years later, I was rewatching one of the film adaptations, and I was just thinking about Mary Bennet. I'm like, she deserves her own story. She's the forgotten sister, and kind of the made fun of, overlooked, awkward sister. And so I decided she needed her own story. So then I immersed myself even more fully into the Regency, like what time, what historical things do I want to happen? And so I really wanted to get into kind of this focus on, okay, what were the historical events going on? Jane Austen's readers would have known all of these events, these like minor references that are there. But as modern readers, we don't catch all of them because we don't have that lived context. And so I really wanted to bring some of like the threat of Napoleon Bonaparte to the fore, and kind of look at these, like the Great Stock Exchange scandal of 1814, where a bunch of rich dudes, some of them members of parliament, decided they wanted to fool the country into thinking Napoleon Bonaparte had been killed, so that way they could drive up the prices at the stock market and sell their stocks and make lots of money, which has really happened in February of 1814. So I wanted to bring Mary Bennet and then connect it to some of these really interesting historical events that were happening, that really I just found by reading lots of books and reading lots of newspapers from the time.
How about you, Dawn? What's the period that pulls you in the most?
Yes. No, I think that like a lot of writers, everything goes in the hopper, like what you live and what you read and what you experience. I would say that the Middle Ages are probably closest to my heart, just right on the cusp of the Renaissance, simply because like other people, that's what I studied. I was an English teacher. And so a lot of these works, we're trying to make them accessible to students. So coming at them from a new historicist perspective and bringing in the culture and all of the things that Katherine was talking about. So that's really, that's probably where my heart is most of all. Although, you talk about Venice, I'm like, oh yeah, I want to write about Venice, or yeah, I want to write about pre-revolutionary France, sort of the other side of the Regency and things like that. I'm a bit of a dilettante, I'm afraid. So,
Matthew?
Well, I was actually a history major in college, and complete disregard to any sort of future lucrative career. And so I'm just a huge history nerd in general, always have been. One of my favorite books has always been Dracula. And if you dig into the history of that part of Europe, the Balkans, I found it just completely fascinating. I wrote my senior thesis on, the Bosnian crisis in 1908. I, read pretty much anything I could get my hands on about the former Yugoslavia, that region of the Ottoman Empire. I always love reading about that whole area, which fits in nicely when you're writing a trilogy about Dracula. You start seeing the adage that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does echo. And you see themes. You start reading about, you read enough of a time span, you start seeing themes in the history of that region, things, similar things happening over and over again. And so it was fun when I was writing, to explore that, how this event in 1389 connects to this event in 1689, and making those connections and writing about those and using those in the plot of the 3 books was fun for me.
So Nancy, I can almost guess, but
Yeah. Anyway, my favorite period is medieval, and I have no books published written in the medieval period. But I've been an Anglophile since I was in the 2nd grade, and I saw this story called When Knighthood Was in Flower, about the romance of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, and Charles Brandon on The Wonderful World of Disney. And I grew up, and like Matthew, became a history major, whereupon I realized that When Knighthood Was in Flower was a highly fictionalized account of this relationship. But by that time, I was already hooked on the whole Anglophile thing. And then a friend put me onto Richard III, the controversy about him and his nephews, the princes in the Tower. And so that's what inspired really this whole trilogy. It started out to be a singleton because there was an alternate candidate, the Duke of Buckingham, King Richard's cousin, as the murderer of the princes. And so the trilogy is kind of premised on that. And the family that helped of wizards who helped him do that, who unknowingly aided and abetted him, are cursed, and the heirs' souls are trapped in a shadowland until they clear the king's name. So this is why it bounces through 3 different periods. And then when I decided to make it a trilogy, I've always loved the Regency. I'm sorry, Katherine, never gotten into Jane Austen, but I do enjoy the period. And I'd never written it because I didn't think I had anything to bring to it. And then when I thought of family curses, ghosts, and magic, and the Battle of Waterloo, I thought, well, that could be fun. It was actually turned out to be a little masochistic as well, but it was fun. And then the 3rd book, I've always been interested in the period between the evacuation of Dunkirk and the beginning of the Blitz in the spring to fall of 1940. To me, it's amazing that Germany didn't just roll right over the British the way they did everybody else during that period. So I set the 3rd book during that period because that let me play in that period. So that's kind of the nutshell answer to Jim's question. And just by the way, since he's giving me grief about it anyway, I would like to recommend that everyone read The Survival of the Princes in the Tower by Matthew Lewis.
How about you, Wendy?
I've been fascinating listening to how everybody got into history, and my way in was a little different. I mean, yes, I did teach history at the high school level back in the day, but that was a long time ago. And it was just one of many subjects that I did. My real foray into history turned out when I went back to university to pick up a gemological certification. I'm now a certified gemologist, which goes into what I do as an artist. But during this training, I was taught insurance appraisal. And one of the periods was Edwardian and Regency and Victorian. And I had to learn what was the jewelry and the items that were prevalent during that time and how to identify them, means of making sure they were authentic, so that I could be hired by an insurance company to certify these items. And it was sort of a gateway to me into these time periods. Not first starting out just learning about the physical items, but then eventually it spilled into culture and to the historical events, because you have to know about where things might have been damaged and other things. But eventually I discovered Jane Austen like Katherine did, but I fell into it very late in life. I was going through a time in my mid-40s where I thought to myself I had not read enough classics, and I wanted to start picking up classical literature just for my own uses. And one of the authors I hadn't read was Jane Austen. And of course, there's several movies out of her books, and she seems rather popular. And I went, I'd like to read one of her books. So I went to the library, and the only book of hers that was even available to check out was Persuasion. So I picked it up and I read it, and I absolutely fell in love with the book. I loved the characters. I loved the intricate writing style of Jane Austen, how she just brings in all these little witty details into her writing. And I absolutely loved it. I ended up reading practically every fan fiction out there related to Persuasion and to Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. There's a lot of it out there. And so when I started writing about, oh my goodness, maybe 13 years ago, I decided to work on two projects. One is based off of Alice in Wonderland, which is a Victorian book. And this is a steampunk science fiction book based off of Alice in Wonderland. It's pretty wild, but I'm still working on it. And I'm afraid it's not available. The other project is the one that you see behind me, The Curate's Brother, which is book one of a series of 4 that I'm slowly getting through. The first book is basically taking her characters. I tell the story through the brother of Frederick Wentworth, the captain's brother, who was a curate in Monkford. And during the summer, his brother comes to visit him. And of course, that's where the premise of the story that Jane Austen tells gets started, but it isn't actually covered in the book. So it's a prequel, but it's in canon with the book. But it also kind of has a few characters of my own that I created to kind of fill in some gaps. And I also love to cover some of the less popular characters that she had. I like to write about Anne's sister. I love to write a little bit more about her father, and to maybe paint them in slightly different ways than perhaps the audience might expect. The book has done pretty well for itself. It's been out for a few years, and I'm hoping to get the rest of the books out within sometime this next year. But yeah, I think Regency is the time period I like the best. I like the Victorians too, with my steampunk settings. And I spend most of my research time in those two areas, just because that's where I'm writing my books. The rest of the time I write science fiction, so that's a whole nother ball of wax. But, when you write sci-fi, you have to know history too, because when you create civilizations that don't exist, you have to ground them in reality. And history is a wonderful place to find background information for things of that nature too.
Well, and I mean, I think as everybody started going along, I mean, we all, if you're a history nut, especially you're writing in a historical space, it's all about the rabbit holes. It's all about how do you get to go dig down into a time, a place, explore it, and then see how you can kind of put your own stamp on it. So when you're doing that, and we touched on this a little bit, but how do you go about researching it? And with the particular stories you've been working on, did the research then spur the story, or were you working on the story and the idea, and then you started digging into the research? What was the one big kind of nugget that came out of that you dove onto? So Katherine, how about you?
Well, so I actually had the idea for the book in 2013, and then I read a book on kind of the Regency history generally, and I got really excited. I'm like, my character is going to be a spy. This is going to be great. And I was trying to do some research on Regency spies, and there's this historian who was working on a book on Regency spies. And so I decided to actually wait to work on this book until after her book was published, because she was doing all this amazing primary research on Regency spies. So I worked on other projects, waited for a few years. After her book was published, her nonfiction book that brought together all the research on Regency spies, I read the book on Regency history. I read her book on Regency spies, and then I used that to kind of narrow my focus. Okay, this is kind of the key components of the time period and of the historical setting that I wanted to use. And then I tend to kind of do a mixture of I don't let myself research too much up front, or I could spend 5 years doing research. So I'll give myself a few months so once I've done some of the initial things and kind of have a solid sense of the overall kind of historical context and what's going on, I'll deep dive on several topics that are going to be really integral to the story. And then I'll start writing. And as I'm writing the first draft, I always have tons of notes. Like I write comments to myself, and half of them are research this, research this, research this. And for some things I will stop and I'll actually go and do the research. I'm like, I cannot write this scene unless I know the basics of, side saddle horse riding, or something like that, where it's going to cause major structural plot problems or character problems if I go ahead. Other things I'm like, I will look this up later, and I force myself to wait till the next draft. So after my first draft, then I do a whole bunch more historical research once I really know, okay, I needed to deep dive also on these areas. And then in my books, what I've done is I've actually put a newspaper heading at the start of each chapter that occurs on the day of the chapter. So, and almost all of them are real excerpts from newspapers. So then once I hit about third, fourth draft and was feeling pretty confident on, my timing, these chapters are happening then I would just start reading dozens of newspapers from every day to find the perfect excerpts. And then of course I would discover something and then have to rewrite the chapter because I had this cool idea or wanted to bring in this context. So it's this constant process for me of researching at different stages and then bringing that in and re-seeing it. And at a certain point I have to tell myself, okay, that is enough. I have to be done. It's not going to be perfect. I did as much as I could. And what I did was really cool. It's good enough. So.
How about you, Dawn? What are the rabbit holes?
what are the rabbit holes? So like a lot of people here, I was a teacher, but I was an English teacher. And I'm sure, since most of you are teachers, you understand sometimes you teach the same thing 6 times in any given day. And Gowan and the Green Knight is one of the stories that I taught. And in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the Lord's wife plays a central role, but she isn't even named. She's really given short shrift. And after 20 years of doing this, I started to get really irritated, and I really wondered about her story. And so I was fortunate in that I knew Gowan really well. I lived in Scotland for a couple of years, so I had a sense of the area. I was fortunate enough to win an NEH grant and spend time on the Isle of Man. So that's where supposedly Gowan was written. Nobody knows. So I came to it with a bunch of really good knowledge and then fell down all kinds of rabbit holes about women in medicine during the Middle Ages. Language was another thing because I wanted to make sure that she was relatable, but she's also very witty. And I spent, I think, probably 2 days reading about medieval curse words. Is this accurate? And there's actually a ton of really fascinating stuff. I read a whole bunch of really raunchy French poetry. I don't know if you know the medieval French poetry is really really raunchy. And so, it gave me a context that I wouldn't have gotten, like, say, in school. So I really fell down some very large rabbit holes about language and culture and medicine. What would have been available? Could she have learned this in England? The answer is really no. So I made her French, and so she was transported, through marriage. but it was, like Catherine said, you just get to a point where you have to stop because, I spend 3 hours looking at heraldic designs to describe a 2-sentence shield. This is nuts. I really, really need to keep going. So lots of really fun rabbit holes. And the sad part was I was still teaching at the time and I couldn't really go in and say, oh my gosh, did you know about the history of this curse word? Or, the things that I think students would have really loved, but I would have gotten fired for. So lots of great history rabbit holes out there. People just go fall down them.
Yeah, but that sounds like something you give the A students at the end of the semester or at the end of the year. Here's your advanced read.
AP Lit, I just kind of read it in front of them, so they knew it was out there.
How about you, Matthew?
Well, a lot of it, like I said before, I'm just a big history nerd in general, and a lot of it, had just read for fun. With the Daughters of Shadow and Blood, the whole idea was it's the Brides of Dracula. Like, it's a similar situation. They're not named in the book. They're just kind of in for part of it and stuff. And so I decided to give them actual names and backstories and things like that. And, if Dracula is an immortal vampire, they don't all have to be from the same time period. They don't have to be from the same culture, since that part of Europe is such a crossroads of different cultures. So I wanted to kind of play with that. So I made the first bride Turkish, from about the 1500s. Second bride is Albanian, 100 years later, late 1600s. The third bride is English, but she's the wife of a British diplomat. So that part takes place in Germany in the 1800s. So, that was, the idea. And then writing it, as far as writing goes, I'm a pantser. Mostly I can't outline to save my life. So, part of it is I just started writing and just I had a draft, I knew things were wrong in it. I was like, but I was like, I'll fix this later. And so a lot of it was just, once I had the first draft, was going back and any parts where I wasn't terribly sure of the historical accuracy of what I was writing, I would go in and do research and fix that, because usually I was, 3/4 of the way there and just needed some tweaking. That was kind of my MO, as far as that goes. Like with the third book, she's the wife of a British diplomat. In the beginning, I had no idea what wives of British diplomats did with their time during the day. So I actually went and Googled that, and lo and behold, like, memoirs written by wives of British diplomats in the 19th century came up. And since they were, written over 100 years ago, they're all in the public domain. You can just download them for free. And so I, read 3 or 4 of those just to get a sense of what she would do with her time during the day while her husband's off, diplomating. And so, things like that were interesting to me. Other things, the cultural things I wanted to include. I read fiction books set in the, in the cultures and the time periods, or close to the time periods where I was writing, because, other writers, have, obviously done similar research, and I could, sort of piggyback off of things that I, have seen in other, like Turkish writers, or books set in Turkey. That was a big one. There's not a lot of research there. I read tons of books on Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, but there's the cultural things I had trouble finding. I had to dig a little deeper for those. Just lots of little. So that's basically how it worked. Is I wrote, I used my existing knowledge to write the first draft, and then went back and kind of dug in just to make sure I was getting everything accurate. And I did, find some cool things that I could use along the way. Like the whole fact that when Nicolae Ceausescu was forced to flee Bucharest, when his regime fell, he was trying to get to Dracula's castle, literally, Tergovista, which was the actual Vlad the Impaler's castle. That's where they were fleeing to, and no one really knows why. So I'm like, I have to use that. So, and it led to, probably my favorite first opening line of anything I've ever written. The third book, the first opening line of the third book is, no one flees to Dracula's castle, not without a very good reason. So, that kind of prompted that, but, so that's kind of to answer your question.
How about you, Nancy?
Well, I usually read a couple of history books, or maybe a general history book and a biography in the period before I start writing. And I generally have a plot when I start in, and it usually gets refined as I read. And as I write, as Katherine said, sometimes there's something I have to stop and look it up right now. But I use stickies. So by the time I finish the book, the rim around my computer monitor is covered in stickies that I have to go back and figure out, what am I going to do with this? For the Herald of Day, it's an alternate history book. The villain changes history to create a dictatorship of the magically gifted, and the plot is about the hero and the heroine trying to fix it. The Richard III element runs through all books, but it's not really central to any of them except a little bit to the last one. So I read Lady Antonia Fraser's biography of Charles II, which had a lot of wonderful period details in it. And when you make up your own history, you can just do anything. And so that one was comparatively easy. The Steel Rose, with its run up to the Battle of Waterloo is one of the biggest rabbit holes I have ever seen. And I was continually learning stuff, like when infantry forms into squares when cavalry charges. Well, I found this book, and I can't remember which way it is now. I looked it up, and it's right in the book, but my memory doesn't retain that anymore. Usually it was 3 ranks, but at Waterloo it was 4 for the Allied army, or it was the other way around. It's like little facts like that. And I have an unfortunate fondness for little facts like that. So it's very hard for me not to get sucked into them. It's like in the Herald of Day, toward the end of the book, there's a running fight from the Palace of Whitehall, which was the main residence of the king at that time, down to Westminster Abbey. And I have this old London map that shows a wall around the complex of the Palace of Westminster and Westminster Abbey. So I'm thinking, well, my people are running to take refuge in Westminster Abbey. Are they going to have to blast their way through this wall? And so that was like a giant vacuum cleaner suck. And I was just trying to figure this out. And finally, my son said to me, Mom, how many people do you figure, like on the planet, know the answer to that? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe 6. And he said, okay, out of those 6 people, how many of them do you think are going to read your book? And I just looked at him and went, it only takes 1. And he just rolled his eyes and kind of threw up his hands. But Waterloo was the big rabbit hole in the Steel Rose. And there's a wonderful book called Dancing into Battle by Nicholas Folks, and that's with 2 F's. Yeah, I see Katherine nodding.
I just read this book. It's amazing.
It is. It's wonderful. And it's all about the British expat community in Brussels in the run up to Waterloo. And it was tremendously useful to try to write that. I'm fond of cataclysms. So I kind of went with changing England's history and the Battle of Waterloo. And then, of course, the Second World War. And I'd read a lot about the Second World War, but I discovered that what I had not read enough of, because I thought I understood it already, was social history. And my friends in England said, you have way too much indoor plumbing in this book. Mm-hmm. That one of my friends, who's a little older than I am, remembers going to the town pump to get water for his grandmother. Other friends of mine in London said they lived in a big house that had been divided in flats. It had communal kitchens and communal bathrooms. So they said, you need to revise your thinking. And I was so glad I had run it by them, because at that point, I started actually looking that stuff up. So it's a lesson in don't assume. I'm a history major, and a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I was a lawyer. So you would think I would know not to assume. But I had assumed, and it's a good thing that my friends saved me from myself. So I think it's always good to read a social history, read a political history, and maybe read a biography if there's one that's got a lot of information that would be useful.
Wendy, how about you? What's your big research rabbit hole?
Well, I started writing The Curate's Brother, and the other book, all of them are drafted. So I have 4 books in the series now. But I started writing it with no historical writing background at all. I mean, I literally just thought I would just write the story and that'd be it. And then I started getting bogged down in a lot of details. There were details about maritime battles. There was cultural details. I knew a lot about the physicality at the time due to my background in assurance appraisal, but I didn't know a lot of the ways things were connected in the customs and the cultures. And I found this totally bogged down my story. Then there's another added element because the book is somewhat of a romantic tale. There are also romantic tropes that I had no clue about because I don't really read romances. It was just something that had not interested me as a sci-fi buff. So I went, I got to start reading more things and understand what I'm actually working on. So I started with reading romance books, believe it or not. And I began to realize that there were certain themes and settings that reoccurred over and over again in this genre that readers would expect to find if they picked up my book. There's a lot of things in historical books that readers expect to find. And I needed to train myself on those tropes so I knew where to guide my story to make my readers more happy. And then I needed to start learning about more of the historical detail. Thankfully, a lot of this stuff is now online. Newspapers going back a few hundred years are now available at the click of a button, and it's free, and it's a wonderful thing. I believe it's the London Times that's on, and a couple other ones going all the way back into Victorian time and a little bit into Regency as well. It's just fascinating to look at the day-to-day news of the time period you might be writing. And when I started doing this kind of research, ideas began fulminating for my book to make it richer. And so the research has really defined my book, I would say. I had the original idea, and those plot lines are still there. The characters I wanted to write about are still there, but the historical detail has deepened everything, and it's really made a difference in the story, as I'm sure it is for everybody on this panel. But there's so much available information. I think Matthew is the one that brought up, he just Googled stuff and he just found everything. It's amazing what technology has brought to us as writers and the resources that are available to us now. So I don't know if I would go as far as what Nancy said, although I'm going to take Nancy's advice to heart. I think it was very good advice. But I would also recommend looking into tropes of whatever you're writing and find out what the readers expect and if those expectations are things that you want to work into your book. Because reader expectations is an important thing. And I guess I'll leave it at that.
Clay, Susan?
For me, it was, and like I said, I mean, most of the time Clay was for Vampire Empire. He had already started drafting a lot of that even before I came on board, because I was working on a World War II novel at the time. But once I got onto the Vampire Empire stories, it was really kind of interesting because it was a period of history that I hadn't really, we took a period and we stopped it because it was steampunk, and we basically got everything up to the normal period in European history. And then the vampire, the vampires rose up and took over the world, and everything changed. It was this beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we had to take that point and then kind of pivot on it, and what the world was going to be 50 years later, now that it's been destroyed by the vampires. And it was really kind of interesting to go dive into those areas that we were working on and try and figure out what was still there, what wouldn't be there anymore, and what kind of shape things were going to be in. And it was kind of for me, it was important. Like we did a whole scene of the original subterranean tunnels that were under London that was going to be, back in Victorian era, is going to be a subway of some sort, an underground train. And that would have been, they had just about started it, and then it would have stopped by the point of our book. And so I got like deep into that whole part of history of digging into what the subterranean tunnels were, how they were being built, what they would look like, what they, you know, what kind of construction material they were using. And, you know, that was a rabbit hole for me, but I loved it. And it was one of the creepiest points of the book, because our poor heroine had to like walk through it in the dark after it had been like infested with, you know, creatures of the night. And it was really kind of a great thing to kind of immerse yourself into that bit of history that was there, and what the workers were dealing with when they were constructing it, and how they might have left it. Another thing I love that Clay introduced me to was memoirs. Looking at these characters, I'm a character person, and I am obsessed with getting the character tone right for the period. So I would write, we had worked on a comic book, Raja Ya, and he was a hunter. And so he was a Victorian hunter, and we started researching that, and I would dive into the things Clay would bring home from the library, which were memoirs of hunters that were going out into the bush, and what they felt like, and what they were experiencing, and what their whole attitude was towards the hunt itself, and the things they were hunting. And you have to balance that with what, you know, because it's a single perspective, and that may not be the perspective you really want to always portray, but you'll have to balance that with the historical knowledge that you're getting from other sources. But you really have to kind of keep those two in a perfect balance.
Yep, no, that's fine. I don't have anything to add to that.
Stop.
That's fine.
Well, looking at history, and I mean, this is one of the things that we always have to balance is, and Nancy and a number of you have kind of alluded to this, it's that idea when you're playing with history, the people that read historical novels are also people that love those periods of time and tend to be nerds about some of the facts and details, and sometimes will love to point them out to you when you're right or wrong. And so as you're looking at that and diving into that, how much, I know it's going to vary because everybody's sort of written different levels of what's fantasy versus truly history. But when you're looking at that and trying to say, how much history are you actually going to use to inform it? Because we're not writing history books. We're writing historically inspired story. How much hard history do you pull in? And have you gotten anything wrong, or that somebody thought at least was wrong? So Dawn, how about you?
How much do I use? I think, like several people have said, I use what I need for the character to make sure that it's genuine, you know, but still accessible. So I use what is needed, which really isn't an answer because it varies depending upon what you're writing. I keep receipts, to borrow a teenage lingo, and I actually have a historical fiction that's set in America, and I had an editor try to challenge me on a clock whether or not it would glow in the dark, and I pulled out all the links because I saved them just in case, you know, someone, but partly for myself, but because I know there's going to be someone out there who wants to know if that clock could really glow. Yes, it could. And actually, apparently I sent her down a rabbit hole about the radium girls. And so, see, yeah, right? So I sent my editor down a rabbit hole. So I've been challenged on that. Have I got it? No, I mean, there's probably something I've gotten wrong, but nobody's found it yet. Maybe they will, and that's fine, because I'd be like, okay, great, I got this completely wrong. With Gawain, we had a little bit of a back and forth because I said it during the 1400s, which is when it was written, and like, but it should be set during the 500s in the historical time of King Arthur. And I was like, yes, but it's a retelling of Gawain and the Green Knight, which is written and so there this back and forth. So I think editors are the biggest challenge that I've faced so far. In a good way. It's a good challenge, in case they're watching. You're fantastic. great. It's just it's a challenge and something you have to be ready for.
How about you, Matthew?
Just thinking of a couple of things like that. My one of them is in the first book. It was kind of a secondary character, but he plays an important role in the plot later. Is the Pasha, the governor of Buda, which at the time was controlled. That Budapest, it was two separate cities for most of its history, but he was the governor of the area of Hungary that the Ottoman Empire controlled. No information anywhere about who this person is, what his name was, nothing. So I made him up. You know, I know that there was a real person who was the Pasha of Buda in 1599, but you know, it's not the same person that I wrote about because I couldn't find any information on him. So, you know, and I figured, you know, I agonized over that for a while, but I figured, okay, if I can't find information on this person, no one's finding information on this person who's going to read this book. So, you know, I felt fairly confident just sort of kind of fudging that part of history for the story. Another one was that was interesting, and I fortunately caught this, is in the third book. One of the main characters is the wife of the ambassador to Germany, from the British ambassador to Germany. Her name was Emily Russell. The ambassador was Odo Russell at the time. And when I started writing her, I had her sort of pictured as an older, you know, kind of matronly lady, maybe in her late 50s, early 60s even, you know, and then I, you know, got to the point where I needed to do actual research on her, and turned to find out she was 35 at the time. So I had to do some rewriting there. Not much, because, you know, she was still older by about 15 years than the third bride of Dracula, Elizabeth. But you know, that was interesting to realize this woman was younger than I am. So that was interesting. That was fun. I'm trying to think. I'm sure there are a couple of other examples of things like that that I, you know, that I did. It's a little easier when you're writing, you know, vampires or horror or fantasy, because, you know, obviously the vampires aren't real. So you can, another character I have, Jovan Ristic, who was a real person. He was the delegate that Serbia sent to the Congress of Berlin in 1878, which is where the third book is set. You know, he at one point, obviously not in real life, but, you know, his character was the head of the Serbian Bureau of Strange Occurrences for a while. And so that, you know, it's fun to play with stuff like that. You know, I found things on him that I could use, real historical things, but also things that you know, I could kind of play with and extrapolate from. And, you know, with mine too, I wanted to, you don't, this isn't a spoiler because the characters figure out this pretty early on in the series, is that Dracula is showing up at certain historical moments and sort of manipulating things for his own ends. And so I actually wanted to use a lot of as much real history as I possibly could, real historical events, just sort of, you know, things happened differently for different reasons than they did in real life, basically, because Dracula was there. So that was kind of my challenge, actually, was figuring out, okay, this happened. What did Dracula do to make that happen, basically?
How about you, Nancy?
Well, actually, I didn't use a whole lot of real history in the Herald of Day because I made it up. In general, I use as much political history as the reader needs to understand the story. And I use the rest of social history enough that it feels like, or I hope it feels like, the characters are walking through the world. The book that stressed me the most was The Steel Rose, because there's a whole legion of people out there who are mad about the Regency and cosplay it on a regular basis. And then there are all the people who reenact Waterloo. And so the combination of those two things was really nerve-wracking. An author who has written a Regency compendium, Teresa Desjardins, was kind enough to help me, and now I have her compendium, so I don't have to bother her anymore. And it was tremendously, it's a voluminous book. She's written numerous Regencies, and that was very, very helpful, because there's a tendency to do a lot of bowing and curtsying when people meet each other, and it really kind of slows the story down with all that bowing and curtsying and presenting and nodding and back and forth. And so I did kind of streamline that a bit. And as Matthew said, what can my characters do to make the Battle of Waterloo come out the right way? And so I took an episode in one French account and there was a French cavalry unit that went in the direction the Prussians were coming from a town called Lasny, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. They didn't go far enough. Had they gone far enough, they would have seen the Prussian army coming to reinforce Wellington, and they didn't go far enough. Meanwhile, Napoleon had seen the Prussians coming, and he lied and told his army it was the French cavalry on the way. And so that's the kind of detail I really, really love. And with The King's Champion, I tried to be fairly realistic about the Dunkirk evacuation, because it was a lot grittier than the imagery the government gave us. And I was trying to get the details right, notwithstanding my issues with indoor plumbing. But I found out that the British Army was not letting the soldiers bring anything, because they wanted to pack every available inch of every available ship with humanity, because they needed the men more than they needed the guns. They weren't taking their packs, they weren't taking their guns in many instances. So then I had a problem, because I needed my heroine, who's a reporter, to get back to London with her notebook and her camera and her film. And so I came up with a way, because she's a woman in this sea of men, so they tell her to ride in the wheelhouse of this Thames tugboat, because I love the whole thing about the little ships and the civilian captains, although many of those had Royal Navy captains, I found out. Anyway, to be in the wheelhouse. And then I thought, well, she says to the soldier, if there's not room in the wheelhouse, I'll throw my pack overboard, because she's already figured out how she can keep the film in her shirt. And that led me down the rabbit hole of, well, how was film stored in canisters during the Second World War? Would it actually hold up if you had to wade chest high out to a boat to get on it? And then I'm like, okay, what did the command consoles of these tugboats look like? And luckily there are websites devoted to the ships, the civilian ships that went over to Dunkirk. And I found one with, like, I don't know what this gauge is, but it's on a stand and it's out from the counter or console, whatever you call it on a boat like that. And I thought, a pack that has nothing but a camera, a notebook, and a spare pair of pants will fit behind that. And so then she gets on the boat and she says to the captain, so, well, how long is it going to take us to get back to Dover? And of course that varied depending on conditions and on which route of the three routes you were on. But he couldn't say anything because I didn't know. And so that led me down the rabbit hole, because there's so many World War II buffs, there's so many Dunkirk buffs. And I just thought, I have to do everything I can to get this right. And at least if I get it wrong, I can say I tried. And the one thing I've been called on so far is a reader who happily otherwise loved the book, said to me in the Herald of Day, in the scene when the characters are eating Stilton cheese, she said, was Stilton cheese big in 1674? And I'm like, I don't know. So I looked it up, and it really wasn't big, as in popular and a done thing, for about 40 years. But I sort of salved my conscience by saying, well, surely people were eating Stilton cheese, even if it wasn't a big thing by then. So that's my, I tend to be a little obsessive about stuff like that.
How about you, Wendy?
I kind of had the opposite problem. I was striving for historical detail with the customs in my characters. And then I discovered a lot of my readers were shocked by those customs. Women that married a lot younger back then than they do now, women not having much autonomy, the customs that were normal for that day period, people were offended by. And I was getting a lot of flack that my characters were not modern enough, evidently. So I did have to make a editorial decision, and I had to make things so that it conformed a little more to today's sensibilities in that regard. I really didn't want to, because I wanted to really have a nice historical rendition, but because my book is basically an Austen variation, and a lot of women who read romances are reading my book, I felt I had to make a compromise. So I strive for historical detail where I can, but when it comes to some of the cultures, I have kind of swayed a little bit more toward the modern era. Like I might have made a character too a little bit older than maybe they were, just because of the situations that they were in. I've had to make some of those changes, and even then, it hasn't been enough. I think some people are just never pleased, unfortunately. But I feel that I've struck an acceptable middle ground for me. So I think the historical readers are going to go, wait, this is a little too romantic. The romance readers might go, oh, this old custom, what is that? And also, a lot of the romance readers don't even understand what the cultures were back then. When I've gone out to speak about my book, The Curate Brother, at Austin Teas and things like that, I've had to sit down and explain what customs of the day were like. What is a come out? Why was it at this age? Why were women basically always seeking husbands? And why were they, why was the standard of beauty so important? Because that was really the only card they had, to be honest. And that's why so much went into that. But I would have to explain this to modern readers who didn't have the background for this kind of thing. But it's all right. I mean, I'm a former teacher, so I teach at the drop of a hat, and I was always happy to explain things. And I think it gave some of my readers that I was speaking to a little more appreciation of history and how far women have come in the last 200-300 years. So we made some compromises as writers. And we do the best we can, and we strike balances, and that's just the way it is, I guess.
Clay, Susan, how about you guys? Because I mean, again, with your series, you're kind of striking the history and then veering to the left a little and veering to the right, and then
which is good. I mean, we have two. The Vampire Empire is alternate history, and alternate history brings a whole nother set of problems, because alt history people are like history people, meaning they all have very strong opinions, but since it's alternate history, they all have different opinions about how history should go. So we got criticized about how the Japanese wouldn't be able to take over Singapore in 1870 because of this, and that, or why this, it was a long, but in general, it's alternate history, so you can kind of look, this is how we did it. Like it or don't, let's move on. Our other series, though, Crown and Key, was an attempt to be a little more historical. It wasn't alternate history, it was a hidden history. There's monsters and magic, but the general public doesn't know about it. But our publisher, Del Rey, wanted a sort of summer blockbuster feel to it. So that meant sometimes the historical elements took a backseat to shooting and running and jumping. One of our readers read the manuscript early and said, this woman wouldn't be able to go to this place without a chaperone in this time period. And, well, too bad she's going without a chaperone, because a chaperone cuts down on the action quota. So you do the best you can. I've found in general, there's going to be the guy who calls you and says, those units didn't wear those color buttons in that time. But by and large, as long as your characters are engaging and you don't have people doing stupid stuff like calling on the telephone in 1820, and you get a general kind of Hollywood sense of the history, by and large, if you're writing action adventure. Now, if you're writing real historical fiction, that's a different thing. If you're writing action adventure with monsters, people are going to go with you. They're not there for the history. They're there for the flavor of the history, and then hitting werewolves with baseball bats. That's a whole different kettle of fish.
How about you, Catherine?
In general, I feel like I have tried to stick very close to the history. I have gotten a few things wrong. And I got an email from a reader about this, about my first book. I have a character named Sir Richard Pickering, and at several points in my novel, I refer to him as Sir Pickering when he should be referred to as Sir Richard, which is not a mortal sin, luckily. I also occasionally have people like, they didn't eat tomatoes very much at that time. I'm like, that is why I had them. I was making a point about this person's character, the fact that she was growing tomatoes, even though they were very rare in England at this time. So you kind of have some things, where you are playing with perceptions. And there's certain things like I spent a lot of time on the Jane Austen thesaurus. You can type in any word and see if Jane Austen ever used it in her writings. I also look on Google Ngram to see when was this word used and when did it start and when did this phrase begin. And I'll find like, oh, I can't use that. That didn't exist till 30 years after my book. Or sometimes I'll look up a phrase that one of my early readers calls me on. I'm like, this was used a lot in 1814, but I can't use it because it feels so modern. So sometimes I won't use a phrase or a word that was accurate just because modern readers, it pulls them out of it, even though it would have been completely accurate and was used often at the time. So you kind of have that balance where you have things like where Jane Austen says, oh, he was making love to her. And I can't write that as a modern writer because that has a very different meaning today in our modern language than it did in Jane Austen's time. So I'll just say, I have to come up with another way to express it that sounds Regency, and I can't use that actual phrase. And other times I, have had to make conscious changes to the history. I'm, a little nervous. I've got a Waterloo book, like, Nancy had a Waterloo book. I have a Waterloo book coming out later this year. And Waterloo is like, it's the one that everyone knows about. And so my historical note begins with, I intentionally changed these things. I simplified some of the naming of the regiments, just giving some I made these changes. And then readers that catch them will be like, aha, I knew it. And know that, okay, this was intentional for the narrative, that we changed the park where this march went through, and we changed the date of Blucher's ball. And, we did some of these things. These were intentional. And other things I've had to change for the sake of the reading experience. So my second book, which is out in a few weeks, The True Confessions of a London Spy, I use a bunch of real historical figures. So I have Lord Cochrane, and I have his uncle, Mr. Andrew Cochrane Johnston. He has a hyphen in his name that he got from his first marriage. And my readers of all the early drafts are like, these scenes are so confusing because we've got Lord Cochrane and we've got Andrew Cochrane Johnston and we've got Miss Eliza Cochrane Johnston, and everyone was so confused. My readers were confused, my agent was confused, but I was like, I'm gonna keep this. And I finally, I got it into my editor, and she's like, I know that this is historically accurate. I know these are all real people, but we cannot do this to readers. You cannot have scenes that are filled with Cochrane Johnstons and this Cochrane Johnston and this Cochrane. You have to make a change. And that was really painful because I'm like, these are all real historical, people. And I want their names to be real, but I had to change Cochrane Johnston's name to just Johnston. And the first introduction, he's like, yes, I'm Andrew Cochrane Johnston, but you can call me Mr. Johnston. I was like, this is so painful, but I did that, and all of a sudden readers could handle it, and they weren't getting all the characters confused, and then I put a historical note at the end. Because, you have to make decisions for your story, you have to make decisions for your character, and you have to keep the reader in mind as well.
Well, I appreciate everybody coming in this evening to dive into talking about playing with historical fiction. We're going to have to do this again because I've got more questions we didn't even get to. But before we get out of here, I want to make sure that everybody knows where to find you. Website, social media, all that kind of good stuff. So we're going to work backwards because I can. So Nancy, how about you?
Well, you can find information about me and my books at nancynorthcott.com. The first 2 books of the Board Kings Honor Trilogy are in Kindle Unlimited, so you can find them on KDP. And for those of you who read romantic suspense, paranormal romance, and science fiction, I write those too. And the easiest way to connect with me is on Twitter, where I spend far more time than is good for me. And you can find me under @NancyNorthcott.
Matthew?
My website is jmsaunders.com. I have links to the Bride's books there. I have my social media links on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, all there. I also have other historical fiction books that are not set in Europe. They're set in my hometown of Greenville, South Carolina, set in the 70s. So unfortunately, that's historical fiction. But yeah, so that's where you can find all the information and links to all the books.
Dawn?
So I can be found at www.dsdeal.com. It looks like Dehel. It's Dehel. And I also have links to all my social media, pretty much what everybody has. I am trying TikTok. Heaven help me. Fortunately, I have a young adult who guides me through. And there you'll find links to all my books. I write romance and erotic romance. So I've got a wide array there, except for sci-fi. I haven't gotten there yet.
Katherine?
So you can find me on katherinecowley.com. I'm also on Facebook as Katherine Cowley Books, and on Twitter and Instagram as Kathy Cowley. My first book was actually just nominated for the Mary Higgins Clark Award, so I'm really excited about that and keeping my fingers crossed till the awards ceremony in April. And my second book has this very pretty cover with like the purple and the snow, because it snowed a ton in England in early 1814. And yeah, so that's coming out really soon.
Clay and Susan?
We are at clayandsusangriffith.com. We are on Twitter at Clay and Susan. We both do Facebook separately, and we have Clay and Susan Griffith Facebook as well. So you can find us all those places.
And you can find our books on Amazon, and you can find our books on our website for excerpts if you want. And they're also on Audible.
And Wendy?
Again, I'm Wendy Van Camp, and you can find me at nowastedink.com. I'm on Instagram as No Wasted Ink, and I'm on Facebook with a page as No Wasted Ink. And any of those will lead you to my books, which are at all online retailers. They're available that way. And I am on Twitter, however, contrary that way. I'm W Van Camp on Twitter. I got to warn you, my Twitter feed is very active, but you'll find a lot of interesting sci-fi notices and other things there. So people tend to like the Twitter feed. Anyway, and thank you all for coming. I hope you check out the Curates Brothers sometime. And it's just been a real pleasure to be here with all these fine authors.
And I've had the pleasure of being you guys' host this evening, Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, and of course here at ConTinual. And we will see all you guys again soon. Everybody have a good evening.
Take care. Bye.